This is a great example where predicting the question is really the way to save it. This is tough question. But we need to know what they're asking, what they're really testing us on. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot of trouble with this. I think the whole thing is just, it sounds weird. Even with the right answer, it sounds kind of weird. So what we want to do is get our brain on the right track. And so when I look at these choices, it's not immediately obvious what they're testing, but the big clue is that we have some choices that have a punctuation mark and others that don't. And even the ones that are kind of changing in other weird ways, that punctuation mark is kind of coming and going. And so if we remember that what do punctuation marks mean, they indicate the structure of the sentence, we can start to think along those lines. So what I want to do is really understand where does this sentence begin and end, and how are all these pieces of the sentence combined, because that's what a comma does. It combines and breaks apart sentences. So we need to see what that relationship is. So the first part is actually using another punctuation mark to really cleverly help us here. Puli and Sakalo describe a more likely scenario. That's a complete sentence, and because of this colon here, which kind of resets everything, this sentence at the beginning is not going to affect anything that comes after it. Okay? Now with a colon, we definitely need to have a complete sentence before it, but we have some flexibility with what comes after it. And you can see there's a lot that comes after it. So we could have just a word, we could have a full sentence, we could have a list. In this case, we have a full sentence. How do I know that? Let's look at what we've got. Most people who heard the broadcast understood that they were listening to a piece of fiction. Sounds like a sentence, right? So I'm going to yellow that. Most people who heard the broadcast understood that they were listening to a piece of fiction. Then we have a comma. What does a comma do? It shows us about the structure. What is this comma doing? Well, with that word but there, it's showing us that we have, that's a conjunction, and so it's connecting two sentences. That's something that's weird because we're already in a sentence that connects two sentences using the colon, so now we're doing that again within the colon we have a conjunction. It's just a mess. But that word but is a reset. And it tells me that this thing that comes after is also kind of be its own sentence. So I have to figure out, like, how is that the case? So I'm not going to underline or highlight the word but. That's kind of a breaking point. The comma plus the conjunction can do that. They can join two sentences. A comma by itself cannot, but a comma plus a conjunction can. So let's keep going here. Some being influenced by the sensationalized news coverage afterward later remembered being more afraid than they had been. Okay, so I got to try to figure out what's going on. This comma here is interesting. It's another breaking point. So that tells me that this part that comes after and this part that comes before are different because there's a break. So what is the difference? Well, let's keep going back, right? So we can keep going back, and this green is going to get into the part that we have to decide if there's a comma or not. So the question then is, does the green start here? Or does it start kind of where the sum, that's where their comma is, right? Because there could be a comma right here. So we need to kind of figure this out. Is the sum green or is it pink? Well, let's try it as green for a sec. That's what I had originally. If it's green, what's the other piece here? What's the sentence? Some being influenced by the sensationalized news coverage afterward. It's not a sentence. It sounds like it's leading into something, right? And that would also maybe be... So here are my green choices, by the way. These are my green choices without a comma. Some influenced by the sensationalized news coverage afterward. Okay, that sounds like an intro. What about the pink? What's that? Is that a sentence? Later remembered being more afraid than they had been. No, it's missing something to do the remembering. So here's the problem, is that green and pink like this, each of them is kind of like part of a sentence, but neither of them could be its own sentence on its own. And that's what I need. I need somewhere after this but for there to be a complete sentence that could just kind of stand alone. So the greens aren't looking good here. They are creating a situation where I'm missing something. Now what the other two choices are doing is by putting that comma there, they are giving me a chance to break the sentence in a different way. Right, so that comma is a break. So what would happen here is, I'm like nervous about highlighting differently. Let's keep the highlighting that's there. So what would happen then is that word some becomes part of the pink. And the comma after the some is a break that inserts the green into the pink. And that green would then be extra that interrupts the pink, but the pink should stand on its own. So that means now that most of the pink is still where it was before, but there's a little bit of pink, this word some, that comes before it. Let's see how just the pink would sound if the some was included. Some later remembered being more afraid than they had been. Now we have a sentence. We have a subject, the some, the people, and then the verb, remembering. So that's what makes it a sentence. That sounds good. Now we're going to interrupt that and make it sound worse, but at least now grammatically, we know that the pink is a complete idea, and we're allowed to interrupt it. That's what those two commas are doing. They're showing we're inserting something in the middle of our thought. We have a comma that gets us from pink to green, and then another comma afterward that gets us back from green to pink. That's okay. We've done that on other questions in this test. That's allowed. And so now the question is, the they were. Is that part of it? Well, here's the problem. If we included the they were, then the green part does kind of sound like a sentence again. They were influenced by the sensationalized news coverage afterward. So in this whole question, we've had a lot of different sentences. We've got the red sentence that I totally crossed out. We have the yellow sentence, which we kind of set aside because it doesn't affect what comes after the but. But if we choose choice B, we're going to have a green sentence and a pink sentence. And those sentences are only connected with a comma. And we can't do that. We can connect it with a comma and a conjunction. We can do this, but a comma alone is not sufficient. This is why punctuation is hard. So the problem with B is it's creating a run-on sentence. We have a pink complete sentence that we're interrupting with a completely different green sentence. We can't really do that. We need other words or things that would allow us to do that. A comma is not going to be enough to do it. So we're allowed to interrupt the pink sentence with a green clause. Something that's just kind of extra that couldn't stand alone. Sometimes it's called a dependent clause. Something that could just stand alone, that couldn't stand alone, that needs to kind of live within some other sentence. But it's allowed to interrupt that sentence. So that's what happens when we don't use the words they were, is that green piece just becomes kind of its own little like mini fragment of a sentence, a piece of a sentence, influenced by the sensationalized news coverage afterward. It's a description. It's a description of the some people that we're talking about. So that's why C is right. This is really tough, right? And this is, again, another hard question at the end of a section, very difficult to deal with when you're running out of time. But I think even if you got it wrong, at least you learned a lot of important things about how we are supposed to use punctuation and what we're thinking about as we try to solve these difficult ones. It's not just about like pauses, it's about structure and what a comma's role is in telling us where sentences are connected and where they break apart and where they're interrupted. That's really what a comma does. And so if you can in your brain do some of the stuff that I did with the highlighters and start to figure out what pieces go together, you'll be able to know for sure when a comma applies. It's a tricky thing to do and learn, but if you want a perfect score, it's essential because they like to throw these very complicated sentences at you where you would not, with experience, know where to place something because you would never write that sentence yourself. So you got to know how to kind of see what they're going for and separate things and know where sentences begin and end, and then you'll know where commas should go and not go, and then you'll know what answers are right and which ones are wrong, and we end up where we ended up here.